Hello everybody, my name is Hans-Willi Schroiff. I'm the CEO of MindChainge, and today I want to talk to you about a new and exciting paradigm to test packagings. This is not what MindChainge normally does, because normally we support you in the generation of consumer-centric innovations, but we have found across time that particularly packs are in the shadow of marketing activities, and this is something we want to change. Now in the following, I will talk to you why we think we need a new pack testing tool called MindChainge. I will talk to you about what the scientific background is of this tool and why it's set up in the way it is set up. And thirdly, I will show you a little bit how the tool works in principle and which type of results you can expect from the tool to shape and improve your packaging. Let's get started with the first question: why do we need a new pack testing tool? Well, a fair question, I believe, because there's already tons of approaches out there that pretend that they can really deliver towards this objective to judge a pack and its communication value. However, the presence and the current situation looks rather dim. GfK, the big German multinational market research institute, publishes a track record year after year, which clearly shows that 60 to 80% of all newly launched products are no longer on the retailer's shelves 12 months later. This is based on a specific methodology in their consumer panel and the trade panel, where they simply track European article numbers, the so-called EAN codes, and they just try to find out which products remain in the market and which vanish from the shelf. Their global rival, Nielsen, comes up with exactly the same conclusion. Now, this is an example of a report which was published in September 2014, and it basically shows the same thing, that 3/4 of all new product introductions are gone within 12 months after their launch. This is sad news in essence, because it demonstrates a kind of major inefficiency in the total marketing cycle and the contribution that marketing makes to the business. A former colleague of mine, Tina Müller, who is now the Chief Marketing Officer of Opel in Germany, a car manufacturer belonging to General Motors, and myself, we have published this German bestseller in 2013. It is a book, Why New Products Fail. And in this book, we actually are discussing multiple reasons why 60 to 80% of all efforts in the marketplace do not make it. Now, I do not want to play back the book to you, but there's basically a couple of issues there that we should talk about also in the connection with packaging. We have referred to the most deadly sins in this book that marketeers can commit. And two deadly sins, in particular in relation to packaging, are the following. The first deadly sin is that the brand benefit, as communicated by the pack, has no emotional positioning, at least no positioning that internally different stakeholders in the company are aware of, and particularly the consumer is left in the dark and completely unaware of what this new product is all about. And this immediately connects to the second deadly sin, which is the coding of the brand benefit. And here, a term has been coined in the past 10 to 15 years, resting on the laurels of the neuromarketing efforts, which is called implicit coding, and we will have to talk about this. So let's talk a bit now about the scientific background and which interesting findings neuromarketing discipline has to offer. Interestingly, our two deadly sins coincide with two main neuromarketing topics that came up in the past 10 to 15 years. The first one is around positioning. I mean, that's clear after what I said earlier. And the term that needs to be reviewed here is what we call an emotional needs architecture. So is there a common set of needs that is innate, so to say, in humans? And how can we use this in marketing? The second thing is coding. And here the distinction I made earlier is the exciting one. The difference between what we call implicit or unconscious coding and explicit and conscious coding. Okay, so let's get back to the first topic now, to the emotional needs architecture. So this is what is actually called a kind of scheme of motivations, and it's set up by a great colleague of mine, Hans-Georg Häusl from Nymphenburg Group in Munich. He actually has summarized all kinds of evidence around what typically drives people's actions and desires. And he came up with this general scheme of 3 major drives. The first is a drive in the upper left corner to exploration and novelty. It's called stimulants or stimulant drive. The second one in the upper right corner is a drive for competition and power, and it's respectively called the dominance drive. And the third one is a kind of opposite to that. Below in green you have balance, which is striving for security and stability. Now in between you have a kind of basic or functional needs like sleep, sexuality, etc. There's a couple of others that are deeply rooted in our genetic code, but the 3 big areas, stimulants, dominance and balance, is the essence and the core of it. This can also be shown in a different way in this one, which is called a limbic map. And here you see again the 3 different drives, but interpolated in between them there's a couple of other things, like for example at the balance pole you have security, safety, health, tradition and loyalty. At the dominance pole you have power, elite, fame, status. And at the stimulants pole you have extravagance, creativity, fun, art, curiousness, toying and all that. So that's a neat yet highly simplified version of what actually drives our behavior and what we're striving for. But what does that mean now for marketing? Now let's take a simple example. Let us assume that you are a marketeer for mineral water. Mineral water is great, yet the functional differences in mineral water are not very substantial. Now, a mineral water expert may think differently about this, but to normal consumers, different types of mineral water can be hardly distinguished in a product testing blind test. Now let's go back to mineral water and let's try to assess, if we would look at mineral water from just a functional point of view, where we would position it on this particular map. And most probably it would be at the balance pole, because mineral water at the end of the day is restoring your body equilibrium and making sure that we are all functioning and working in a proper way and in a balanced type of way. This, however, in the functional way, is not the way mineral water is actually marketed. So let's look at the next layer, which is the emotional layer. And here we find a number of substantial differences. And these are products from the German mineral water market, where we see that there's already a kind of major distinction on this emotional level. For example, you have something on the right side, which is called Fachingen, F-A-C-H-I-N-G-E-N, and this is positioned on health and control and everything. And you find it a lot in nursing homes and in these types of institutions. While in the upper right corner, on the testosterone-soaked male dominance pole, you have Active O2, which is something you find a lot in health clubs, and that's a very, very different positioning from the nursing home type of mineral water. And you can even take it a step further and look at mineral water in a kind of self-expressive way. And this is what we've done here. So beyond active O2, there is even something more to demonstrate your superiority and your power and your dominance. And this is Bling H2O, which sells for $420 per case. And the logo is on the bottle in neat Swarovski type of bling jewels. To make a long story short, we believe that the limbic map that you've seen here is a very, very good way to differentiate your brand positioning in 3 different layers: on the functional layer, on the emotional layer, and the self-expressive layer. And this is something that corporations have to decide on, and we find that in many, many cases this is not perfectly clear. But we would maintain until the end of the day that a brand needs a positioning, and this positioning today is probably less functional and probably a lot more emotional. Let's look at an example. Here we have 2 beer brands in Germany, very well known, yet very distinct. Again, if you would do beer tastings in a blind test that is not showing the brands, it would be very few people only who would be able to correctly identify which one is Krombacher, that's the beer on the left, and which one is Beck's, which is the beer on the right. However, if you identify them, totally different worlds would emerge, and Krombacher would be the more nature-oriented type of beer with advertising that shows a lot of wooded areas in Germany, and Beck's would be the adventurous beer with a ship with the green sails, and where youngsters jump off the ship, swim to the shore to get a bottle of Beck's beer. So very, very different worlds are emerging now that we're looking at the emotional positioning of these 2 brands. What this all boils down to is that at one point in time, corporations will have to decide where their brand is positioned. Now, let's assume we are using this framework that I was referring to, the limbic map. It would be a decision that would finally decide where to put the brand and which type of emotions are deeply connected with this particular brand or service. So for example, yeah, that would be here, and that would be near the balance pole, and that would be the positioning of the brand that we put to market. So far on positioning, and now let us move to the second topic, which is implicit coding. If I would ask you the question now on the following slide, which wine is more expensive? What would you say? Well, I think even after an exposition time of just a fraction of a second, most people would vote for the glass on the right containing the more expensive wine, and the glass on the left, probably not. So typically it's between 98 to 99% of all respondents that would say, even after an exposition time of 500 milliseconds, that is half a second, that the wine on the right would be more expensive. But the question remains, how do they know that? Because they basically cannot know it, particularly not after 500 milliseconds. Now this is where neuromarketing theory comes into play. Now let us look at the simple signal path that, for example, the perception of a pack actually takes in our brain. So we have a pack here, which is a simple German detergent pack. And the first thing that would happen to the signal is that it would be projected on the visual cortex. Here the signal is sort of wrapped up and prepared, and then it moves into an old brain structure which is called the limbic system, which is composed of different types of brain regions. Something is happening in this limbic region, and we'll get to that in just a couple of seconds. And from the limbic region, actually the signal is moved into the prefrontal cortex, and this is where our consciousness is located. So at this point in time, we see it in a sense that it becomes conscious to us, and we can decide about it, and we can take the pack off the shelf, which would then send out respective signals to our motor neurons from the motor cortex, and the purchase act would be accomplished. This would be, roughly speaking, the sequence of events that goes on in our brain when we perceive a pack. Now, the exciting region, obviously, is the limbic system, and we devote a little bit more time to that now. What is actually happening in the limbic system are basically two types of activities. Now, first of all, there is a connection to what we already know, so we remember something about it. So have we seen it? What is it? That's the first question that the brain is asking in this particular region. And those objects have an advantage where we have experience with, that we have seen in the past, and that we can connect a meaning to, something that we remember. The second, and probably even more important thing that's happening there, is that the signal becomes emotionally flavored. And that means that a kind of emotion is attached to it, and mostly this emotion is a type of reward. So what's in it for me? Not just what is it, but is it good or is it bad? And into which emotion, remember the emotional architecture we talked about before, is it paying into? So what type of reward is it? These are the two things that are happening here, very, very important and very, very fundamental for our cognitive functioning. The striking thing about these two things is that, well, what's happening in the limbic system is happening very, very fast. It's happening very, very fast. And it's largely unconscious, as I told you before, because only when the signal reaches the prefrontal cortex, it becomes part of our consciousness. So whatever is happening in the prefrontal cortex and the motor cortex is very, very slow compared to this. So important to understand that we have a kind of very fast brain and a very slow brain. And one of my academic advisors, Daniel Kahneman, has written this wonderful book about it, which is called Thinking Fast and Slow. It was on the bestseller list for a long, long time, and I think it is a must read for any marketeer. So, in a nutshell, it means that we have, on the one hand, this fast processing, which we call implicit processing, highly efficient, with a huge capacity, 10 million bits per second. That's incredible. It's unconscious and it's comprising all kinds of sensory channels in parallel. So it's a huge processing capability that we have here. On the other hand, if we cross the dividing line between fast and slow, we have explicit processing, which is not efficient at all because it's serial. And the capacity, consequently, is just about 40 bits per second, which is basically nothing. It is conscious, yes, but it is very, very, very slow. And it came quite late in our genetic development, so that means it is mainly verbal. So text reading would be a good example for it, which we can only do in a kind of serial fashion. If we pause here for a moment and just call to our minds the huge amount of text portions that we find on packagings today, it is already clear by now that these parts on a pack are not really efficient in quickly communicating what the offer is all about. Let's move now to the opportunities we have to code, and let's look at a couple of coding channels here, which are huge. So we can code something via language, via words, word sounds, etc. We can use episodes that people are familiar with, scripts or stories. We can use archetypes, use symbols, faces, for example, are huge symbols. George Clooney's face is a huge symbol for masculinity, etc. We can use brand signals, etc. And we can also use all kinds of sensory input, which is colors, forms, shapes, sounds, visuals, and all those things, which usually are, and you know where I'm pointing to already now, which are usually characteristics or features of packagings. Let me give you one example for a coding channel that's not so obvious. If I would ask you which styling brand, and styling is hair styling, hairspray or hair gels, etc., which styling brand does stand for more elastic hair? So elastic hair would be the kind of positioning or the benefit that you would be talking about. And I'll give you the names of two brands in Germany, and it doesn't matter whether you're from Germany or not. So the first brand would be Taft, and the second brand would be Velaflex. Now, irrespective of where you do this, already the sound of the words provides a clear signal in favor of Velaflex. And even a formula in a blind test of Taft that would outperform Velaflex in the area of elastic hair would be gone and would be smashed to pieces by the time you put a brand context around it. So already the word sound, the harsh sound of Taft versus the soft sound of Velaflex already shapes the expectations of the product in the limbic system. Now take a look at this pack. Let's move to pack style. When you do a kind of tachyscopic test around it, you show it only very briefly, brief exposure times like 200, 300 milliseconds, etc., up to 1 second. The majority of people, 80 to 90%, will tell you after the third of a second, around 330, 350 milliseconds, that this is a banana drink. Isn't that sensational? I think it's sensational to get the product category after less than half a second. Wonderful. This is implicitly coded, and the limbic system is decoding this particular object rapidly. Let's move to another example. If I would ask you which properties these two products have, which is a kind of potato chips product and a kind of yogurt drink, you would probably say, well, they're not that heavy and they are good for my weight, etc., etc. But the characteristic that both packagings have of being tailored definitely pays into this impression that is generated. And when you again compare these types of products in a blind versus identified test with just a plain package, a plain white package, and a tailored design package, you will be surprised at the differences that people voice when they evaluate these two products. Another example is the question, is this a male grip? So there's always a person opening a kind of deodorant product here. And again, 80 to 90 people that I asked in this type of test would say, no, it is not a male grip. This is not how males typically open a pack. Now, particularly company marketed a male deodorant product with these facets and with these features. It was a big flop in the market, and one of the reasons obviously was that it was not that gender typic as it should be. If I ask you, is this a product for men and for women, and I show you the product in a second, you would say yes, this is a shower gel product. It strongly resembles motor oil, and it's a big selling item, particularly for men in the United States. Now, what is the net message to be derived from that? Let's go back to our limbic map for a second. And let's start there where we left you with this particular positioning that I was using as an example. Now, if this is the positioning of the product in the emotional needs architecture, then a necessary consequence of it is that all the touch points that we have, all the marketing mix factors, should be exactly on this same positioning with their codes. So the function should be there, the aesthetics should be there. If a detergent is, for example, positioned on stain removal, then it can't have rose-colored speckles, obviously. The pack should be there, and all the pack features, and we get to that in a second. The movie, the film should be there, and all other kinds of branding aspects should also be located there. So in other words, there should be a huge consistency between the different touch points or layers of the marketing mix. And since these layers are resembling a backbone, we call this principle consistent backboning. So the consistent backboning principle is underlying lots of things in the MindChainge philosophy, but particularly the issue around pack testing. So let us now move on with a typical shelf. This is a shelf that I photographed a couple of weeks ago in a market here in my neighborhood, and it's kind of food additives, vitamins and all this. And already at first sight you see that most of these products are quite similar in terms of appearance. There's no product that particularly sticks out, and it doesn't get better on the subsequent examples of this particular product category. Here let's take a look at another example, etc., etc. It's interesting to note that when you debrand those products, so you take the brand name away by using Photoshop or something else, like I've done in this example here, it's quite difficult, even for pharmacists who sell these products, to tell me who's the manufacturer and what is the brand. Now, in that case, it's a derived called derived. It is obvious that this is an untenable situation, and we must do something to make the brand more communicative, to use the pack as a device which clearly sticks out, which stands out and transports a specific message. So let us now turn to a brief tool description of what PackChainge is actually doing. And let's see what we have here to make you understand a lot better how the tool actually works. It's based on something that we call reverse stripping, and I have to explain to you what that is. Now let's assume I would ask you the question, what kind of product is that? So probably you would come up with lots of things, and you would say, well, from the form and from the shape, I would say that it's probably a product to refuel my lighter or things like this. It could be a kind of oil for sewing machines. This is what we had in Germany in the 50s or 60s. And now I would subsequently give you a little bit more cues as we move on. So I could show you the brand name, for example, which is Rebel Green. Would this be a major help for you? I don't know. I could show you the visual, and again, maybe you would be left in the dark, maybe you would know. So we have to go down to the last level, to the level of verbal encoding, to make sure what type of product it is. It is a fruit and veggie cleaner, and I think you would not have guessed this from the initial appearance of the form, the color, the shape, the visual and all kinds of things. So I don't want to make a judgment about this right now, but for a fruit and a veggie cleaner, it would be a form, a shape, a color, etc. that would not lead us automatically to an implicit understanding what this product is all about. So we'll have to get very close to the shelf, we'll have to read the text until we finally know that this is a fruit and veggie cleaner. So we actually use this paradigm in order to test our packaging via PackChainge. We start with something that is only form and color, maybe in some cases just form, not even a color. Then we would add typical visuals, we would add the brand name, and only towards the very end we would come up with all the verbal inscriptions on the pack. Let me show you an example from the OTC category, so over-the-counter drugs, what I mean by that. And let's start out with an example that looks like this. Now, what do you think it is? To be absolutely honest with you, 80 to 90% of the people that we ask at this point in time, they would say that this is a toothpaste. That this is a toothpaste. And they are clearly convinced about this, and they say this with a high degree of confidence. Now, if we move on, and we asked them basically two questions. And the first question here in Germany is, what type of product category is it? And what type of brand is it? Okay, and we could ask all kinds of other questions, but in this particular example, we were asking them, probing them about the product category and about the brand. So here we have the shape, a kind of rectangular shape, and we have a kind of design or colors of the pack. So the next thing that would be that we introduce a feature, and the feature is this. So it's a kind of lid, obviously a lid by which you close this particular pack or not. And still, the majority of people would probably maintain that this is a toothpaste. Okay, Now the next thing we introduce is a kind of visual. That's the visual on the pack. And it's a kind of orange background, and a human scheme is jumping and obviously excited, or whatever you may interpret with it, about it. So and then the verbal explanations already start. So it says something that is 23.2 milligram gel, that it's against inflammation, that's a painkiller, and that you put it on your skin. And then you say it's a painkiller gel 40, which means with a strong effect. And then finally the brand name comes up, Voltaren. So it's a kind of painkiller that you put on your muscles when you are sore and things like this. Interestingly, the subjects are totally led astray by the initial communication of the pack, and this is reflected in how we represent the results. And this is what we see here. We refer to the two questions, product category and manufacturer brand, and we look at those percentages that have correctly identified the product category in the left part and the manufacturer and the brand in the right part. Now, the differentiation on the x-axis is between form, color, visual. These are the implicit type of cues that we send, and then we have the various text portions, which in that case were also 3 text portions. So what you see here is that the product category is not really identified by form, color, and visual, just a minor percentage by the visual. You know the visual, it comes from the text, so from the explicit part of the packaging. And when you look at the manufacturer and the brand, it even gets worse. So the manufacturer or the brand is identified even in the text portions only very, very late. And this indicates that there's obviously a high text-based communication in this Voltaren package. The next example I want to share with you is the same thing, and now we're not going through the different pictures of the reverse stripping. So it's a kind of vitamin cream for face care, Rugard, and what you see here is basically the same thing, not really identified via form, color and picture, but mainly due to the text. And that's something that applies to most of these products that you've seen on the shelf that I was showing you a couple of minutes ago. There are other examples. For example, this one, where very, very early on, already when you show the color of the pack, the product is immediately identified because the color and the form and the visual in that particular case has been so deeply connected to a German audience that they immediately recognize it. It's this product which you might not know, but it's fairly known to every German, and when you already show the color of the pack, people would immediately know what it is. Now, where does it all boil to? It all boils to something that is shown on this chart. What we actually want to do at the end of the day is increase the purchase probability, and this is what we have on the y-axis here. Now on the x-axis we have something related to coding, and we can, according to the consistent backboning principle, code something which is consistent to the positioning, and we can do something that's inconsistent with the positioning. So the codes do not reflect or do not stand for the positioning at all. Now let's assume we have a product and we test it in a blind test, and we do this both in the consistent and in the inconsistent conditioning, and the outcome is fairly comparable. What I'm describing you here is a kind of outcome of many, many types of tests that we did in that regard. So blind would be comparable because there are no additional cues that people can learn from what the product is all about, and there's nothing that can sort of preset the limbic system in order to raise different expectations. Now, if we do this now identified and we have the consistent condition, we see that the purchase probability is actually increasing because it becomes clearer and clearer what this product is all about. And if we use all coding dimensions, including the form, the color and the visual, I mean, this just becomes fortified and very, very clear. If it's inconsistent, now guess what happens? It becomes less. So the advantage you have in the blind test, the performance that you see there that results in a certain purchase probability, is going down because the messages around all this are kind of inconsistent. The consumer is confused on a more or less high level, and this is something that's detrimental to your marketing efforts and to your purchase probability, and as a consequence, your success in the market. Now, finally, the difference between the consistent and inconsistent identified test is your contribution of the packaging design, of the contribution of the marketing function. And this is what finally needs to be delivered on top of the product in order to make consumers feel good about the brand that they're purchasing. And it becomes a kind of essence of the brand personality per se. Now, in a nutshell, we believe that the PackChainge paradigm is offering you huge probabilities to make use of your implicit coding opportunities in a very, very consistent way. It requires that you have a fairly good idea about your positioning. It requires your pack agency to have a fairly good knowledge about all the codes that can be employed to design a consistent coding array for this particular brand. But at the end of the day, what you will have on the shelves will speak to the consumers in the fraction of a second in a very, very consistent way. If this is given, if the consumer has a very, very clear idea right from the start about what it is and what it is not, your path to marketing success is there, and we will help you to orchestrate this and accompany you along the way. Thank you.